Hi everyone, my name is Natasha Lightfoot and I'm a professor of history, associate professor of history at Columbia University, and I teach on the subjects of Caribbean history, slavery and emancipation in the Americas, and black politics and black identities. And I have been doing this now for the last 10 years. This is one of my two children, Avery, who was born the same year as my first book, which came out in 2015, on the history of the transition from slavery to freedom in Antigua with reference to Barbuda. That book was called Troubling Freedom, Antigua and the Aftermath of British Emancipation, and it was published with Duke University Press. So that is a little bit of what I do. Well, there's a lot that happened in the Bronx in the 80s and 90s that shaped who I am. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of black immigrants who ended up in the Bronx over the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and my family is one of many who my parents came from Antigua in 1969 and 1970 respectively, got married, had me and my sister there, and they surrounded themselves with a specific network of folks that they knew on the island. So it was really interesting to kind of have this dual upbringing. I tell everybody that I went to school in the United States, and then when I would come through my front door into our apartment in the Bronx, it was like I had entered Antigua. My father and mother were very much interested in what events were going on back in Antigua, and they would surround themselves with people who also did the same. So, any election, any sort of happening that was going on in Antigua, they were debating it and thinking about it in their living rooms in the Bronx. So that's one part of my upbringing. But then also what was happening in the Bronx itself was very much um, a, a sort of a touchstone for me in terms of my development as a scholar. The Bronx was the site, one of kind of ground zero for the crack epidemic, for AIDS, for the housing crisis, basically all the disinvestment in black communities in the United States, and seeing so many examples of both people who were definitely mired in those multi-layered struggles to survive, and then also seeing people who were trying to thrive in spite of what was happening. Just being able to understand how communities form in the midst of crisis and try to protect themselves and their youth. Being able to say that, yes, we went to what were good schools that still sort of had a consciousness of wanting to make sure that kids, knew the basics and could be able to, really think for themselves. That was actually something that was happening in small pockets. We went to a church that was really sort of nurturing. We went to the Boys and Girls Club and we learned the arts there because the arts were being taken out of schools increasingly. So stuff like that was all a part of who I am, who I think I became. And, I think being able to balance both the island roots that were always a part of my understanding of who I am, and then also absorbing everything happening around me, like, the development of hip hop and the fact that, like, the Bronx was this place where people made ways out of no way. All of that, I think, influenced the way that I read the subjects that I would eventually want to write about. All right. So I became interested in history when I went to Yale. I actually would say that high school I had a love of history. I took advanced placement history courses and learned a lot, but it was very much a lot of facts without interpretation. But Yale was the first place where I really learned the art of historical interpretation and realized that all of history is an argument. So I started out at Yale, unsure of what my major would be. I always loved novels, so I thought I would be an English major, and then there were all these requirements for the English major that seemed like I'm not gonna really find out much about who I am from Chaucer and all that kind of stuff. So I passed on that and then wandered into a history course, and it was the beginning of me falling in love. I took lots of different kinds of history, but ended up spending a lot of time on African American history. And there was a really strong history department in the 90s at Yale that actually, funny enough, myself and another colleague who's also a Yale undergrad who graduated in the 90s talked about how that department produced a lot of people who are working historians in the field now. Um, Clearly, they bred a love of writing and reading and researching history in that department, and I'm very thankful. So I took a number of classes, intellectual history. I took a course on, African history, a course on the history of women in the United States. And then I happened to decide that I would do a senior thesis, and ended up being paired with Glenda Gilmore, who's a historian of African American movements, progressivism, work against Jim Crow in the post-Civil War South. And she's just an amazing historian. She just recently retired from Yale. And I went to her retirement celebration. I had to thank her because, and she's the first person I thank in my book as well, because she's the one who told me as I was doing my senior thesis that I'm actually really good at this and I should think about doing it professionally. I had no idea that anyone could really make a living doing that kind of thing. Even though I was interfacing on a regular basis with professors at this esteemed institution, I did not see myself in that position at all. And I come from a long line of people who are working class people. So to be able to even think about anything beyond college was a kind of privilege, really, that I hadn't even allowed myself to settle with. But her encouragement made me apply. And so, ended up getting into a couple of really good PhD programs, and decided on NYU as the place to go. And I ended up taking the history of the African diaspora as my major field. And that changed everything for me. Much of that program was dedicated to understanding how Black people were dispersed. The transatlantic slave trade, of course, is the central feature of the story of the African diaspora in a way. So we spent a lot of time in classes talking about how slave systems were erected and spread. And over the course of my time as an early grad student, I kept saying, gosh, we spend so much time on slavery. When are we going to get free? So, so that was the first bit of how I ended up doing the work that I do. Was just this literal obsession with, well, God, what does freedom really look like? What does it mean? And after all these years, I'm still not sure that I know. But, I'm glad that at least that program inspired me and gave me the tools to ask the right questions about it. The other thing that happened while I was in grad school, my father passed away. And my father was someone who had a business in Antigua. He did a lot of work here. And so I spent a lot of time in Antigua after his death, just trying to help, sort out his affairs, etc. And it was at a crucial time in my graduate career. I was preparing for my comprehensive exams. And it was a real turning point for me, because that tragic time actually, because it forced me to spend so much time in Antigua, it also made me realize that a good portion of the questions I had been asking about, you know, what is blackness? What does it mean to be free? How did we get here? Where are we going? Had always been underlined by my understanding of myself as a child of Antiguans and as somehow, not technically, but once removed, a daughter of the soil. And that, to me, was what set me on the path to then marrying all of my intellectual questions with focus on Antigua and trying to ask, well, what did freedom look like here? And what does it mean to render all of these big questions in a very small setting like this? And, does that change things? Does that, complicate things a bit? And it does, but then it also, so there's a way that you can look at Antigua as something distinct. The story of freedom here does have its own particulars, but then it's very much a variation on a theme, for the Caribbean and also for post-slavery societies up and down the Americas. The Atlantic world is full of places where people were told they were free one day and then spent the next several generations being denied that technical freedom in one way or another, and then have them having to find other practical ways to really make that life in freedom mean something and actually feel free. So, that I think is sort of what has always been my intellectual obsession. And it was that sort of time, that extended time here while in school, that really helped me crystallize it. So. Mhm. Oh, I would say my mother. Um, my dad was always someone who had big ideas but needed the sort of the help to execute the nitty gritty. Whereas my mom, for her, love is in the details. She's very detail oriented. She's always multitasking and on top of every single thing that she's doing. And it can be crazy making. And I see where it makes her crazy, and also I see where it makes me crazy. But I think that that's certainly where I learned how to be able to be as attentive as I am to the nuances in a given document, to be attentive to how people say and represent what is happening in their lives. You just have to always be thinking about the details and then what sits behind them. So yeah, my work ethic is definitely my mother's work ethic. And I'm happy for it, even though I'm also exhausted.
What's a normal day like for a professor?
There are no normal days, to be honest, because it all depends. I mean, when the semester's in session, it might be a teaching day, and you might be prepping a lecture, or if it's a seminar, you're reading student responses, because my lectures sometimes range in size from about 75 to 100 students. My seminars are usually anywhere from 12 to 15 students. And when we're meeting in a seminar style format, it's a little bit more intensive. It's really conversational. Whereas the lecture, I'm just sort of kind of, sharing the facts, and, might have like brief Q&A. And I have a team of teaching assistants who are graduate students in process with their own PhDs, helping to sort of keep the class moving smoothly. They lead discussions, they help with grading, etc. But when I'm doing a seminar, it's a little bit more, sort of intensive. So I read alongside them. I'm, reading alongside what I've assigned for them to read. I'm reading their work on a regular basis. So it might be that. It might be faculty meetings. There might be on-campus lectures, or other academic events that you want to sort of show your face at. There might be a student protest you want to show up at and support. There might be some kind of public history event that I might say yes to, because I do that a lot. That's one of the things that Daryl and I were talking about off camera earlier, is that I say yes to a lot of things, especially when I'm in Antigua. So this is the fourth time that I've spoken as a professional academic in the last week and a half. So technically Antigua is never a vacation for me so much as it is me somehow combining leisure and the work of spreading the good word of what the island's history is. So yeah, there's also the days when I'm going to conferences, and that means travel. That means, spending a whole lot of time listening to lots of people talk about amazing work that they're doing, which is in one way energizing and in another way intimidating, because they're doing such amazing work, and it makes me think I've got to raise my bar. So yeah, there's never really a dull moment as a professor. The most enjoyable experiences involve students being thankful that you taught them what you taught them. And to me, that's the only reason to show up and do it, is when people tell you, thank you, I learned so much. I actually, in my office on campus, I have a mantle because the building is, Columbia is full of these old buildings. And so I have a non-working fireplace in my office. And on the mantle for the fireplace, I just have about maybe a good 50 or 60 thank you cards from the years that I've been teaching there. A number of students who thank me for just the experience of being in one or another of my classes and saying, that they felt really enriched by it. There are many who've become sort of diehard fans and taken multiple classes with me. I've written recommendation letters for them. And it's nice to see them out in the wider world just doing amazing things, which is, it's kind of nice. I feel like also when I'm here, people thank me profusely for writing the book that I wrote, for doing the work that I do to talk about the importance of Antigua's history in a particular moment when I think politically people are quite energized and interested in how history bears upon current politics. So I'm always happy to be a part of these conversations. So I think that's the best part of being an academic, is to be able to know that the work I'm doing is not just for academics. It's for people who want to learn and know more about, who they are and how the past bears on their present. The experience of being a female professor, I think, is particular, and I would say it is layered for me in intersectional fashion with the fact that I'm also a black woman professor and on the younger end of the teaching faculty in my department. So those things all together, my age and perceived youth, as well as my race and my gender, all play a part in how sometimes I'm often not read immediately as faculty. So for instance, in one of my lecture rooms, there was a problem with the projector. Yes, sweetie? What that? That's a motorcycle passing up the main road. How's a motorcycle sound? Right. Okay. That's a motorcycle. That's a motorcycle. Yes, Eve. Okay. I know it makes noise. So yeah, the idea that essentially who I am becomes often read as maybe a student or administrative staff, and there's nothing wrong with either of those roles. But when you spend close to about 10 years getting a degree and then putting yourself through the work of being on the tenure track at an Ivy League institution, which is essentially hopping through several rings of fire. It would be nice to be acknowledged in the role that I've actually earned. So at times, I'm aware of who I am almost acutely. And whereas there are, older white men in my department who teach in jeans and can sort of walk around bumbling and play that kind of absent-minded professor role to the hilt. And wear, kind of like holes in the elbows kind of thing. I'm always very well dressed to teach. I always I'm particular about my presentation because I don't want to be. I'm hoping that can at least mitigate against my being mistaken for something else other than faculty, knowing that won't protect me. Right. So again, the subscription to a certain type of respectability politics, knowing that respectability politics won't save me from discrimination, is really interesting. I still do it. Meanwhile, there's also the issue of ongoing harassment. I've never myself experienced this in the course of the profession, but I know many women who have, from graduate school right on up to now. There are lots of women who just report the rampant nature of harassment in academia. And academia, as the way that it's set up socially, is ripe for that kind of thing because you're not poised to succeed without mentorship. And the relationships that mentorship often breed can be ones that allow for improprieties. I see, sweetheart. Nice job. You're filming too.
Hey.
You and Evie made movies. I love it. But can you not play that? Because mommy's taping. Mommy's making a movie. So can you play that over, like quietly over there on the other side of the gallery? Can you? Thanks, babe. Appreciate you.
He is so like.
Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah. So the question of harassment is a big one that I think that the academy has to have a reckoning with, a full reckoning. I know that the U.S. Academy, more and more stories are emergent. There's more work to be able to put it out in the open that yes, this has gone on for too long and the protection of serial harassers needs to stop. In my own department, there was one and he was quietly forced to retire. And I do believe that we need to do better than even that. Because we need to be able to make these environments safe for young women, young scholars of color to feel that they too are welcome. And I also have mentioned in meetings about this subsequently after finding out about the harasser that, the work that needs to be done around protecting women. I'm glad we're talking about it, but we need to talk about also the fact that we're not talking about race because that's even more tacit. The sort of ways in which the academy is racially exclusionary. So I, in particular, said in a meeting, it's important to ask yourselves, who do you even consider to be scholars? Who's on your syllabi? Who are you teaching? How welcome are certain subjects in your classrooms? Um, favorite favorite film or documentary?
Don't say coming
Oh,
to America.
oh no! My God, no! Because the problem is there are so many, and I don't really know how to choose a favorite. Um, goodness.
You want to do a book instead?
That's also trouble too. But can I just list a couple of favorite books then and favorite movies? Um, so I what came into my head when you said documentary, a recent documentary I saw in love was I'm Not Your Negro about James Baldwin. And I love Black Panther. I watched Black Panther so many times on planes recently, and that's a problem because it's long, and I'm supposed to be writing and working and grading papers on planes, and that just didn't happen. It just as soon as I saw Black Panther was on the menu, I was watching it. It was almost criminal to see it on those small plane screens. Let's see, what else have I seen that I've loved or always loved? As a child, my favorite movies were The Muppets Take Manhattan and Grease. I love musical theater. I love musicals. So Grease was always one of my favorites. Um, let's see. I don't know. I feel like I could watch. I'm also beginning to become more of a TV junkie. I'm really into TV more than the movies recently, because the movies are also like $15, which feels criminal. So I'm watching lots of stuff. I'm watching The Crown on Netflix. I'm watching Pose on FX. I'm watching Claws on TNT. You know, I like shows that depict women of color and women doing strong things, strong women doing strong things. So those are right now some of my TV obsessions. Books, anything by Jamaica Kincaid, anything by Edwidge Danticat. Um, I would say The Farming of Bones is the first book I read that I literally cried at the end. I've never cried about a book before. I've read books and been impacted and felt, oh, that was really a wonderful read, but The Farming of Bones literally made me weep. So anything by Dante Cott, anyone should just decide they should read. A Small Place I teach all the time. Read it. If you want to understand the Caribbean condition post-colonially, that is still the go-to.
Three people. It could be male, female. It could be Caribbean. It could be American.
Yes.
Whatever. Inspirational to you.
Well, I would say Walter Rodney. I think Walter Rodney was just an amazing historian and activist and died for it. And I would love to have been able to sit down and talk to him. I think The History of the Guyanese Working People was just an incredible book. And much of how I thought about my book was very much inspired by his book. So if I had the chance to meet him and speak to him, I would be eternally grateful, and I would say that he's definitely one of my inspirations. I mean, to be honest, there's so many that could be so many people here. You know, my parents even, my grandparents even. You know, so I don't know if I want to get into kind of personal stuff because that's just too many people. So. Yeah, good job. I'm also intrigued by Winnie Mandela. I am like, you know, I think just the complicated nature of her life, the fact that she was a political widow in a way, she performed a certain type of, you know, when Nelson Mandela wasn't there, she was sort of mothering a movement. And yet she went far beyond conciliatory politics. She was a revolutionary in a way that especially the Western media couldn't handle. I'm intrigued by how her life was lived and understood and misunderstood.
Okay.
Yes.
What would you say to anyone that wants to become a professor?
That it's really not easy and the market is terrible and you should only do this not just because you love it, but because you figured out that you're willing to research and you know, sort of immerse yourself in this work, but also that you are absolutely okay with parting with the academy even after you've done this work, because the academy is just not set up to absorb everyone who's getting a PhD.
Okay. What do you love about Antigua and what does it mean to you?
Antigua means everything to me. It's a part of who I am. I mean, you could say typical trite stuff like I love the beaches. I mean, it's gorgeous here, right? It's a lovely place to be from. And anytime I tell anyone that I'm from Antigua, people get jealous. I'm like, yeah, sorry. And I said you're from, you know, Peoria, Illinois or whatever, but it's nice to be from Antigua. But yeah, the meanwhile, I would also say that a lovely thing about Antigua is the complexity of its culture. You know, and it's always been intellectually intriguing for me. Understanding as well the complicated relationship between Antigua and Barbuda. And Barbuda itself is another fascinating story. What's happening there now is criminal, and we really need to reckon with that as a nation in Antigua and Barbuda. But, you know, in time, I guess, the point is there's so much here to understand, and so much to understand about how the world works through seeing it, the lens of Antigua and Barbuda's long arc of history. So that, to me, is probably my most favorite thing about here. To be honest, I want to be remembered as being a good historian and a good mother. Simple as that.